Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. I am Lindsay and I am one half of the duo that is friends till the book ends. Danielle is on vacation this week, so she's having fun. She's enjoying her life. So I thought I'd just pop on and do a couple quick kind of solo videos so that there's still content being put out. But be rest assured, Danielle will be back soon. But yeah, so today's video, I thought that since I am the fantasy fan, I am the fantasy lover of this duo, that I would kind of do a beginner's guide to fantasy, because I know that sometimes fantasy can be a little intimidating to people if you're not used to it or you're not comfortable with it. So this video is going to have 5 young adult titles and 5 adult titles that I think are good intros. So let's go ahead and get started with the YA picks. So for someone who's not familiar with YA fantasy, I think that these 5 books that I'm going to recommend are really good ways to kind of get yourself into it, because they often have very universal tropes or themes that you can find in a contemporary or in a mystery or maybe other genres that you read from. So the first book that I'm going to recommend, Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and this is a West African inspired fantasy. So right away we're kind of set in a culture that you may or may not be familiar with, but so interesting and super cool. So our main character's name is Zaylee, and she lives in a world where there used to be magic, and people who had magic were very powerful. They were kind of revered, but then a new government and a new regime took over, and they outlawed magic, and they basically killed everybody who had or possessed magic because they were a danger to their throne, to their rule. And so Zaylee, her mother was a reaper, someone who was able to kind of communicate with the dead and call souls and do all these really cool magical things, right? So she has the opportunity to bring back magic. There's a scroll that is found that basically dictates that you have to go on this journey, you have to do these certain things, and if you do that, you can bring magic back to the land. And so she sets off to do this, but she also gets a straggler who is the outlawed princess. She's a runaway princess who joins Zaylee's cause because she doesn't believe in what her father is doing. There's a love interest. There's lots of really interesting and fun tropes in this. I listened to this as an audiobook, and that's partially why I'm recommending this as a kind of starter for YA fantasies, because the audiobook is fantastic. The narrator just really does her job well. It's not confusing at all. So if you're worried that you might be confused, it's not at all. She's fantastic, and this was just such a good book. The second book is also out, great in audiobook. We're still waiting on the third book, if that will ever come out. But this one was definitely a booktube kind of took by storm a couple years ago, but I haven't heard many people talk about it since then. But I think that this is a really good intro to YA fantasy. So the next book that I want to talk about, I do not own, but that is going to be Renegades by Marissa Meyer. And this is a really interesting and fun series. So this is a really interesting and I think good intro to YA fantasy because it's kind of a mix of like a Marvel movie and a fantasy novel. So if you really like superheroes and Marvel movies, I think you're really gonna like this book. So in it, we're following a girl named Nova, and she does not like the superheroes. They're called prodigies. And in this world, it's kind of almost like they recruit people. So a lot of people have special powers, and you can kind of go through this like academy and train to become a superhero. And Nova is not a superhero. She's actually kind of like she's not a super villain quite, but she's like an anti-hero, and she's going to infiltrate the prodigies and the academy and join a team in order to get revenge on something that happened to her and her family that she thinks that the superheroes are to blame for. Then you meet a boy named Adrian, who is the son of the 2 most prominent superheroes out there, and they kind of have a thing, and it's just such a good series. It was really fun. It's a 3-book series. It is completed, but it kind of is a good intro because I think you would be familiar with the concept of superheroes and supervillains if you've ever watched a DC or Marvel movie or you've read comics, and it also kind of is set in our world vaguely. It's kind of like a metropolitan New York kind of setting, and then also it's just really fun to learn about all the different powers that people have and kind of this very timeless trope of the struggle between like good and evil, and is there kind of a morally gray in between. So I would highly recommend this series. So the next book that I want to recommend is actually a standalone. I think that a standalone fantasy is a really good way to kind of dip your toe into the fantasy genre, but it's okay if you don't love it. because there's no pressure to finish more of them. That's going to be The Shadows Between Us by Trisha Levenseller. This was the first Trisha Levenseller book that I had ever read, and it's also my favorite, coincidentally. This is a fantasy romance. It's very short, so once again, it's kind of like low stakes, low time commitment, but this is such a fun read. In it, we're following a girl named Alessandra who is tired of being overlooked. So she comes up with a plan. First thing she's going to do, she's going to woo the king, who is kind of this mysterious figure. He has these shadows that wrap around him for protection. So that's kind of where that magical fantasy element comes in. Second step is she's going to marry the king. The third step is she's going to kill the king and take the throne. She just wants power, essentially. I think that is the main criticism that I've seen with this book, is that our main character, Alessandra, she doesn't necessarily have a driving force behind what she's doing, except she just wants to be, she just wants to have power, which I think is a fairly good reason. So as she kind of ingratiates herself with the king, she realizes that she's not the only one who's out to assassinate the king. There are multiple attempts on his life, and while they kind of get to know each other, because he is attracted to her instantly, she's very mysterious. She figures that she kind of learns some things about him, and she realizes that maybe he's not so bad after all, and it's just I really liked the romance aspect of this. This is a fantasy romance, so that is kind of going to be more of a prominent theme. So I think that if you typically read more romance novels, I think you would really like this book, because the fantastical elements are there, but like I said, it primarily does focus on the romance, so I don't think you'd be too out of your element if you kind of went and read this when you don't typically read fantasy. The next book that I want to recommend is a series that I do not think gets enough credit. This was one of the first books that I had read when I had kind of reinvested myself within my reading journey last year, and that is going to be The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owens. And this is such a good, underrated fantasy duology. So it's a duology, which is nice because, once again, it's kind of like a low commitment situation. Fi is the future chieftain of her clan, the Clan of the Crows. Series in general, I think that this has one of the most unique and interesting magic systems, which I think is a good intro to a fantasy world. If you're not typically someone who reads fantasy, I think that this is still unique, but not unique to the point where it's like confusing because it doesn't make any sense. In it, this world is kind of divided by caste systems. So at the top, you have your phoenixes, your swans, your hawks. Those are the powerful entities, the powerful people who have special power. And each caste system kind of has a different power attributed to them. And Fi is the leader, or she's going to be the future leader of the crows, who are the bottom, the lowest dredges of society. They are called the Merciful Crow because they are the caste of society that has to deal with the plague and murder victims. And so nobody wants this job. Nobody treats them fairly. And Fi also has a really interesting power. Her clan has power that they can take the magic from teeth. So for example, if someone who was a phoenix died, and that's kind of the highest level of society, and they extracted their teeth and took them, they would be able to tap into the magic of that person, the special magic that the phoenix caste has. So they are able to kind of take and pick different parts of magic from people, but it's all relying on this kind of like bone or teeth magic, which I think is super interesting, and I haven't quite read a fantasy novel that has that exact trope before. But this was so good. It's got action, it's got adventure, it's got romance, it's got just twists and turns and plot twists, and I just thought this was such a good duology, and I believe that the author is coming out with her new series this fall, so this would be a perfect time to check it out. So the last YA fantasy book that I wanted to recommend is an urban fantasy, and so urban fantasies are fantasies that are set within our world. We're familiar with the setting, but they kind of have a twist to them, and that is Legendborn by Tracy Dion. And I think this is such a good intro to fantasy because not only is it an urban fantasy, so it's set in North Carolina, it's set on UNC's campus, but it also is taking the myth of King Arthur and kind of the Round Table and turning it into something different. So you might be familiar with the myth and the setting, which would make this a really interesting and easy fantasy book to get into. So in it, we're following a girl named Bree who recently lost her mother in a tragic accident, except Bree does not think this is an accident. And in order to kind of get closer to her mother and her mother's legacy, she joins this kind of summer program that allows her to study on UNC's campus as a high schooler and take classes there in order to prep for college. And her mother went to UNC, so that's kind of the connection there. But when she gets there, she witnesses a kind of magical attack one of her first nights there, and she realizes that there's secret societies on campus, that King Arthur's myth has something to do with what's going on. And this was so interesting because it also touches on contemporary topics. So topics that you're going to find in like an Angie Thomas book or a Tiffany D. Jackson book, like racism and generational trauma. A lot of the challenges that Black people have to face going to a predominantly white institution and feeling as if they don't really fit in. So this has a lot of interesting contemporary topics that is really, really beautifully interwoven with the fantasy elements. So I cannot sing this book's praises highly enough. This was such a great book. It was my favorite, so far it's my favorite read that I've read this year. And it deserves all the hype that it gets. Okay, so the next group of books that I'm going to recommend are adult fantasy books. So these are for people who either predominantly read YA fantasy and they want to transition to adult fantasy, or someone who just kind of typically reads adult books but not fantasy. So the first series that I'm going to start out with is the Witcher series, specifically The Last Wish, which is kind of the first book in the series. It's a collection of short stories, and there are actually 2 collection of short stories before you get to like the actual start of the series. So I would recommend both of those to start out with. The reason why I'm going to recommend this is because a short story collection in a fantasy world is much easier to get through, I think, than a full-blown 500-600 page novel of one continuous story. In it specifically, we're following Geralt, he's a witcher, so he's kind of like a dude who is outcast by society, but he also provides a very important service to the society because he kills and gets rid of the monsters that nobody else wants to deal with. So we're following his adventures, and these books are so funny. I think that is one thing I didn't expect, was that this is kind of an older fantasy series, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but they are so funny. They have some really interesting characters, and it's very witty, and it's really enjoyable and easy to get through. Like I said, because it is the start of a series and it's a short story collection, it's pretty quick and easy to get through, and you can like read a story one night and then, you don't have to pick it up for the next couple days, and then you can read another story and you're not really missing anything, you're not forgetting things. So I think this is a really fun and easy intro into the adult fantasy world, and if you liked the collection of short stories, then there's, I think, a 5 or 6 book series after that you can go ahead and read, so I think that is kind of a nice compromise. The next adult fantasy book that I would highly recommend is Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. And there are so many reasons why I think this is a really good adult fantasy starter book. The first reason is that it's under 300 pages, which is unheard of for an adult fantasy, and yet you don't feel as if it's too short. Rebecca Roanhorse is such a masterful writer that she packs everything that you need to know about the story into these, it's I think 287 pages, and you don't feel as if you missed out or that it was cut short. And so in it, we're following a woman named Maggie, and she lives in a world that has had the apocalypse happen. It's a climate apocalypse, so the world is now like divided up into these different nations, and she's Navajo. And so she kind of lives on the land that had belonged to the Navajos, and she's a monster hunter, a monster killer, so you can kind of see some parallels in the books that I'm recommending here. But so it's her job to go out and kill the monsters, and she kind of has a special ability that I won't give away that allows her to really excel at this job. One day, Maggie is roped into finding a missing girl, and what she stumbles upon turns out to be much bigger than just a single killer, a single murderer, and the story just kind of escalates from there. And she meets a medicine man who, is a very attractive medicine man, and so they kind of have to team up together and solve the crime and kind of figure out what monsters are roaming the earth and what do they want. This has so many interesting aspects to it. I think that if you read dystopian novels, you would really like this book. I also think that if you want to learn more about Native American folklore and mythology, this is a really great intro to it because it does a really good job of not babying you and not necessarily like explaining everything into like such detail that if you already knew the legends, you'd be like, yeah, we get it. But it also doesn't like glance over and just assume that you know things, if you're understanding what I'm saying. So I think it's such a good book. It currently has 2 books out in the series. I believe there's going to be more. But the second book is just as short, and I didn't love it as much as the first book, but the first book was so good. It took me by such surprise, and I think that it's a really good intro to adult fantasy. Okay, so the next book that I would like to recommend is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames, and this is such a fun adult fantasy book that could be read as a standalone. There is technically a second book in the series, but I haven't read it yet, and I don't necessarily feel like I have to read it. So this does stand by itself pretty well, and I think this would be good for people who really like Game of Thrones, or any sort of like that kind of TV show, because this picks up on a lot of similar themes but is much more lighthearted. So in it, we're following a band of has-been mercenaries. Back in the glory days, they would kind of go out and fight monsters and, you know, assassinate people, and they kind of had their own thing going, and they were treated basically like rock stars. But their age has come and gone. They're I think in their 40s and 50s now, and they've kind of broken up. One of the old mercenary members shows up at our main character Clay's door and asks for help in rescuing his daughter. His daughter is trapped in a city that is under siege, and he's like, we need to get the band back together so that we can go rescue her. So Clay and everybody gets back together, and they go out on this mission to rescue this guy's daughter. And this book is so wildly entertaining. I did not know what to expect when I went into it, but it's so funny, and it's such a quick read. A little over 500 pages, but it doesn't feel like 500 pages. So I think that's why I would recommend this for a first-time fantasy reader, because it pulls on a lot of like classical fantasy tropes like dragons and mercenaries and you know, assassinations and weird magicians and potions, but it doesn't feel like old. It feels funny and new and vibrant, and this was so great, and I highly recommend this for a good start. So next I'm going to recommend The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, and this is book 1 in a African-inspired fantasy series, and in it we're following a group of people called the Omehi people who have been essentially fighting a war for the last 200 years that they can't win. And these people have been gifted with some extraordinary talent. 1 in every 2,000 women has the power to call down dragons. 1 in every 100 men is able to kind of magically transform himself into a bigger, stronger, faster killing machine. So they kind of call on these magics in order to do that, and that's what they've been relying upon in order to kind of win the war against their enemies. If you're not one of the gifted, you are basically just fodder, casualties that nobody cares about. So our main character is Tao. He is young and he is giftless, and he is basically just destined to go fight in this war and die. His plan is to go into the war, get injured real fast, and then duck out as fast as possible. But he has an encounter with the members of the higher castes of society, the gifted people, who essentially are very full of themselves and think down on everybody else. He has an encounter which leaves him devastated, with the people closest around him murdered, so he is going to go out for revenge. So he decides he's going to dedicate himself into becoming the greatest swordsman ever to exist. Even if he's giftless, he's not going to let that stop him. And so basically this book follows him in his journey. The series has a lot of really interesting kind of elements to it. So you have the fighting. So if you're someone who kind of likes military strategy, maybe you read military history, I think that you would like this book, because there are a lot of fight scenes and a lot of military kind of strategic parts where they kind of have to figure out how to best approach a situation, and that does go into detail. If that sounds boring you, I promise it wasn't actually boring. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it, but I ended up loving it. There's also kind of a training montage thing where he goes to the training camps and he gets picked to be on this like squad essentially, and him and his teammates have to kind of toughen up. They have to, you know, train and eat right and train some more, and there's the magical component to it that's really fascinating. So then you actually have the fighting, and it's just such a cool fantasy series, and I really loved the second book as well, and there's going to be a third book, I believe, that's coming out next year, so this is a perfect time to start the series. So the last book that I'm going to recommend is a historical fantasy, so this is perhaps for people who enjoy reading historical fiction or are familiar with like Mexican or Mayan folklore, and that is going to be Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia, who has quickly become one of my favorite authors. So in it, we're following a girl named Cassiopeia whose mother comes from a very rich family background, but her mother decided to kind of break off and go marry a poor commoner, and so she was disowned. However, that man dies, so Cassiopeia and her mother return back to the family, where they are basically treated like servants. They do not belong to the same class of society as these people, and they make that very clear. Now, Cassiopeia's grandfather is basically just like the biggest jerk ever, and in his room, he keeps a locked chest, and nobody's allowed to go in it. Nobody knows what's in it. But one day Cassiopeia is cleaning, and she's just kind of gets fed up with how she's treated, and she's like, you know, screw this guy. I'm just going to open up the container and see what's inside of it. And in it, she opens it up and she unleashes a trapped Mayan death god. And this death god requires and / demands Cassiopeia's help in reclaiming his throne that has been stolen from him by his treacherous brother. So it's a short standalone novel when you're following Cassiopeia and this god as they kind of have to go and complete these tasks and travel to the underworld in order to have this guy reclaim his throne. And this also, it has love, it has such a rich Mayan and Mexican folklore and mythology and culture enriched into it that this was just fantastic. I loved our main character. I loved our interest. The ending, I feel like, could be hit or miss for people. But like I said, this is such a quick and fun read that it would be such a good starter for someone who's not familiar with adult fantasy but kind of wants to get into it. So those were my 5 recommendations for YA fantasy beginners and adult fantasy beginners. Let me know down below if you've read these books or if you plan to read them and if you think that they would kind of fit the prompt here. I'm also thinking of doing a kind of beginner's guide to science fiction as well, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. But thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in our next video. Bye!